Thank you very much. I guess it's a pleasure to be here. Um, it goes to show that there's a lot of interest in on the land activity. And I remember a long time ago, I didn't say very much. But at the time, uh, the elder was saying that if you got nothing to talk about, at least talk about your experience. And those experiences are based with my activity through work and initiatives. And one of them is um, remembering uh, my early childhood. Um, at the time, I remember people going out to the Barrenlands by boat before they started using airplanes back in the 70s. So you see people get in a boat and they kind of disappear out onto the lake, not to be heard for at least more than a couple of weeks. And when they came back, there was a lot of celebration. And at that time, it kind of gets initiated from the community and comes back to the community. But before that, it was wherever people lived on the landscape. And our first real organized canoe trip happened in 1988 when we were meeting with elders, and we were talking about going on the land and maybe even having a gathering out somewhere in the bush. And so they kind of said, well, we live in times of conflict. We live in times of conflict, and we need something to have peace within ourselves and among each other, so that we're speaking the same language, and we have the same goals. And one of the best ways to do that is to go back onto the land. And so they determined that we should go back to Messel Lake. It's a peace-making place from the 1800s. And I've heard the stories before, but to see it for the first time, I think was going to be kind of a dream for me at the time. And so when it came time to talk about, well, how we're going to go there, the message from the old people were simple. We'll fly, you guys go by boat. And so that's how we ended up with our big On the Land program the first time in 1988. And we had over 500 people there. And so, funny thing, the further back you go, the less you see material things, because all they did was take their tents and their rifles. The rest they just harvested from the land while they were there. And now it's very difficult to do that now. So that was our first one, but trying to do it the second one the year after, in 1989, we kind of joined forces with our regional body that manages education. So they were looking for a mission statement for the schools. And so we got the elders together, and while the elders met, and they produced a lot of paper. It's just mostly interviewing them. Not interviewing them, but we had an elders conference made up of just strictly elders. And we said, no translation, we're just going to talk in our language, and we'll transcribe it later. So they talked for a good 3 days, And that's where the document, Strong Like Two People, comes out, is that after 3 days, they reviewed the history to where we are today and the challenges of the day. Is that we need to ensure that our language, culture, and way of life is passed on, but at the same time, respecting the future generations that are getting involved in modern day things. That really, this is not about giving up who we are, but strengthening what we have. So that we should be strong like as we were before, but take the modern tools so we can benefit from programs and things that can be developed through there. And so 1989 became a bringing almost the same amount of people back into the bush in a different location. So now we had a different trail to follow. So then we went there by boat again, but this one was on a different trail. And when we got there, they again talked for 3 days about an expansion to what the early talk about how we can integrate education and culture. So we produced another big booklet just from translation. And then in 1990, the elders got together and produced from those proceedings the Strong Like Two People document. So I think it was around that time that in the early 1990s, very difficult to find people to go out in the bush with. Very, very difficult. And finding, motivating, and doing anything. I'm not saying that people weren't going in the bush, they were, but more of an individual family basis. But for a big group, it wasn't. So then I logged on to the Prince of Wales. They were going to do an archaeological survey for the first time. So I kind of lobbied my way to it, and we ended up working with an elder named Harry Simpson. And so we did the survey for 3 summers. And at the end of the 3rd summer, one of our latest trail was when we had to go to where he spent his childhood and where his parents are buried and where they used to live, and the places where they lived was still intact as if he left it yesterday. And he was saying that, well, what happened to all these people? We're here, we're doing documentation about people that I remember who were there, and I have to remember it so it can be put on a document. Where's our people? They're not here anymore. They're in the communities. The land seems to be empty. And that emptiness is something that goes back to the beginning of our own time, where the land was being threatened of being devoid of people because there was conflict between animals and people. And the story of Yamuza started to emerge, even though I've heard about it before, but going to the actual sites, every one of those sites, and most of those original sites are doing things in ritual. Of even a place where when his Yamuza and his brother was discovered by an old man, and he started to raise them. And the camp that he was in, people were moving on, but he decided to stay where he was to raise those 2 boys. And so when time went by, when they got a little bit older, they liked to do some tricks to the old man. So when he was sleeping, that they carved a hole on top of his head and threw in some hot rocks. And so the old man had a seizure. And so if you look at one of your booklets, you'll find that that rock is called Kwedu. And so one of our travels, we came up to this Kwedu site and we climbed it. And we could see on top of it is the old man's head, the top of the old man's head, and there's a big crack in it. And then there's a big pile of archaeological material, mostly people in ancient times breaking off stones and looking for the right one to make tools of it. And it's just a big gravel pile. It must have been going on for thousands of years. And so you can see where people knelt next to a crack in a rock, and they'll take one of these stones and drop it in there. And there's supposed to be water on top of this hill, so that if the rock falls into the water and it hits a side, it means that the earth is comfortable with you. And if you don't hear it, it doesn't mean that you give up right then and there. It's just a signal to say that maybe you should make adjustment to your life. Because everything pre-contact was about being in spirit with. Being in spirit with the land, the environment, the animals. The conflict between animals and people was taken care of by Yamuza in his story about the travels. So when those sites are visited, and there are very many, along where he traveled all the way to the North Arm, and it continues on to the East Arm for somebody else to pick it up. And so I get to hear all these stories, but at the same time, I'm kind of involved to some degree on the political side, not up front, but in the background. So you get to hear a lot of things too. About the early days when the land and environment was being taken without consultation. And when the old people rose to work together, that somehow they had to pick a logo. And if you remember the old days of the Dene Nation, they had a kind of like a bird. Some people would say it's a raven, others would say it might be an eagle. But regardless, it goes back to the beginning of time. That they would choose a bird that can speak many languages. Because when the old people got together back in the early 70s, they knew that by speaking in one voice in a language that they can all understand among each other, that the symbol was important. So I think that carried for a long time until the organization became like organized. And when you get organized, you have to transform. Now you have an office, you have a constitution, you have a bank account. That now you can start measuring the linear time of the organization and choosing of leadership and all that kind of stuff, that they came up with the second logo. And the second logo that came up in the mid-70s, I think, was the logo of Yamuza. And Yamuza for the regions, especially speaking for our region, it's a time before contact of how the world was at the time. And people were in spirit with the environment, with the animals, and everything within it. And our big law at the time, the laws of Yamuza, is to coexist with your surroundings in a landscape that you're familiar with. So the land in its development, shelters, holes, gives indicators of what it has. And it has very many fishing holes, lots of them. And so the early place names after the story of Yamuza is that it charts out the travels and the places that he's been as the first set of place names, pre-contact, what happened during that time. And after the animals and people separated, the conflict was resolved by Yamuza, that people started to put place names on the ground to mark out where the fishing holes are, where the caribou crossings are, where the caribou fencing is, all the quarry sites, where the moose lives, and even getting a little more technical is that in our area we have 5 substances of soil, and we have maybe about 7 trees at least. So that if you match the substance of soil with the tree and put in a place name, that kind of makes a determination of the type of fish in that area. So listening to stories and collecting stories, in the old days when they're sharing stories using place names. And so they're passing on information so that if you're ever in that area, you know where the sites are. So the early place names pre-contact has no names that are associated with people themselves, because it was more important to know where the animals were. And at that time, people's experiences were also documented on the land, so that the land starts to tell the story for us to pass on to generations whenever we travel on it. So the land provides all this activity, and the people get to know the land because the land speaks to them about what it has and how those things can be used. So the language derives from the landscape. And the more connected we are to the landscape, the stronger the language is. And we know that since the 60s and 70s, and even earlier, the impact happened after contact. After contact, it was mostly early explorers. They're greeted and they're shown the country. They were shown our resources, how we live, how we can survive, and the stories that we have. But really what they're doing is taking an inventory of what we have, the richness of the land, and the map towards future exploration. So the first impact was that there was other people that came in that we had to share those resources while they were here. That was the first contact. And when the trade came in, we continued to harvest and maybe even a little extra so that they can be given to the trade. And eventually, with the contact with the governments, that they needed an agreement because it's a requirement of them from a 1763 proclamation that they have to secure the rights from the Aboriginal people in order to make it public. And so the early written treaties is about, okay, now we have the land, we have the ability to give the interests to developers. So those developers, mining companies and anybody else, are part of the treaty partnership. And it's more recently through IBAs that we have to say, well, you were given the rights through the treaties, the written version. But our understanding of what we have is that the landscape is going to be altered forever. The richness from the land will be extracted, and whatever left over from it, the waste is what that we would end up with. So it's very important to know that those things were given through the treaties. So an IBA, impact and benefit agreements, has to be done. Okay. Because those monies belong to you, and it comes from the exploration of those lands, it's very important to not sink it into more contemporary training, but to use those monies to sprinkle people back onto the landscape through using your own monies. What else are you going to use it for? Set up another office, another program? No. It came from the exploration, so let's sprinkle people back into it. So since before contact, we know we had contact, and a lot of our mentality is around this new relationship that has never really developed. But what happened, interestingly enough, is that those early contacts with the newcomers were also documented onto the landscape. So we know where the early explorers came, where they traveled, and the hardships that they had, and the relationship or not having a relationship with you is also part of the narrative. And so somehow we've been following that story to where we are today. It doesn't take away from the original documentation of what the landscape is about, but we didn't pull it with us because we are part of that original landscape. It's never going to move. And so when you start talking about Aboriginal rights, treaty rights come later, but Aboriginal rights is that you use this land in a way that it renews itself, your relationship with it, your leadership with it, your way of life, that it still continues to be there today. And when we talk about land claims and self-government, we know that we can't do anything to alter the landscape because it's not possible. And the stories that belong with it is still there, but we need to bring it forth. So when we talk about self-government, people have many minds about it. But we know that there is a system of leadership that's attached to pre-contact times. In our communities, we know they exist. They're just not part of the local structure, but they exist. And then through the Indian Act after the treaties, a system was set up of Chief and Band Council so that Canada can have some way of doing exchanges with people that are not recognizable as an entity in Canada. Because to transfer public monies, you have to give it to some accountable entity. And so how do you give entity to people of treaty status? Very difficult. So one of the ways of them dealing with their management of people was to create the act so that the decisions go back and forth between a group under the act. And their communication pipeline is the BCR, Band Council Resolution. And so you pass a resolution and you sign it and send it to Indian Affairs. And then they'll bring back a check for core funding. And then you have to kind of go back and forth and do reports. So that system has been with us at least since 1870. So it's like being living in a bubble of how to treat and work with people, because you got to remember that Aboriginal people didn't get to vote until 1960s. And you're not registered anywhere. And so the only way that some form of relief and disempowerment engagements happened was through that process. So that, but it didn't change where people were at. They still lived off the land. They still practiced their ways of living. And today's term on governance is really about what kind of structure would work that takes into consideration the old system and some blended new ones, because we're dealing with accountability and selection of leadership and accountability, transparency, that some structure has to be brought in. And it's not the structure that owns the land. It's the people. And the structure is just to provide accountability to them. Okay? And the authority, some authority rests with those elected bodies, but limited to the point where they can't affect your way of life. So it's just a management of modern day resources, but anchored into protecting what was there before. So when we're going forward, we see that the influence from the outside sources are very, very influencing, that we didn't forget who we were, but we can only ride the wave of what was made available and what is recognized by the authorities of Canada. To the point where we kind of know where we're from, but we kind of just a step away from where we were before. And the further you step away from the land, we get away from the original teacher of the language is the land. When it first spoke to us to say that here's where the fish are, here's where the moose lives, here's where the caribou cross, and this is good berries and all that kind of information that it provided to us, it communicated with us. And in that communication, we need to bring people back into the landscape so that we reconnect into an environment of teaching. And so when I kind of heard about this on the land get together, that what we're really talking about is grounding, somehow finding a way of grounding ourselves back onto the land so that the natural environment for teaching the languages and sharing our experiences as to what the land holds. All the stories from the beginning of our own time and all the impacted place names since the early explorers came in. And ironically, most of those impacted place names are negative. It's just to show that there were events that happened in these areas that allowed for some destruction to the landscape. And we have very many of those. And so there are levels of place names. So if you go on the landscape and travel the trails, and you hear of a place name following the traditional methods, you know how old that place name is and which category it comes from. One of the early things that I was involved in back in the early 80s was got an opportunity to work with elders, but I was working as a stationary engineer at the Chief Jimmy Bruno School. And you get to see a lot of officials go through the building, mostly from Yellowknife superintendents of education and managers that come in. And so when you're going from station to station to check on your equipment, I was on one of those rounds. And in the early days before the reconstruction of the school, they had little seminar rooms with little small elementary seats. And I couldn't ignore but see one of those officials meeting with some elders in a little seminar room, sitting on these little chairs. And so the official kind of motioned for me to come over. And so I came over, and what he wanted to do was he wanted me to interpret. To interpret some of these policy changes and the impact that it's going to have. And I didn't hear anything about language. I didn't hear anything about the way of life. And so these old guys had to kind of try to figure out what benefit is doing some policy that the community or teaching the young people, they don't see the benefit. But I guess they kind of liked the way I interpreted, so they got me to start hanging around with them. And so that started that relationship towards getting more involved, towards a land claim back in the 80s. And after the demise of the Denham-Métis agreement, we went regional, and we had to get a chief negotiator. And so they asked me to be the chief negotiator, and I said, well, I don't know anything about land. You might be better off getting some administrator to do it, because I don't think I can do it. And so one of the things that, with a room full of elders, was that we're not asking for your opinion, we're saying, want you to take it, because there's over 50 of us here. If we add all our years, it adds up to over 1,000 years of knowledge. And it's those things that we want protected. So if we can teach all that stuff, but it means going back onto the land and having many campfires. Because anytime you build a campfire, it draws people to it, and then people exchange information. So the more campfires you have, the more you know. So what we have is that we have a system of governance that was transported into the area, and most of our disputes is always about what are we trying to implement, because some of the things that we're implementing with modern governments is to weaken people more. And our view is that we should be strengthening ourselves, but do it in a way that we reconciliate our issues towards a common understanding for delivery. Okay, and that's a term that's starting to pop up on the national levels, but where does it touch the ground? It touches the ground at the local level. So the term for me, decolonization, is, well, this is what we had before, our first recording of pre-contact, before colonization. And since then, we've been impacted by early explorers, trade, developers. Those kind of things kind of draws us away from our original source, where the strength to fight, and not only fight, but to put into terms of development to ensure that at least minimal damage is done. So today, when we talk about doing traditional activity, on the land activity, it's super hard, very, very hard. You need to have a community of people, administrators, elders, all these people to come together to organize. But if you want to do anything in modern education and training, that's the easy part. Very, very easy. It's very easy to be drawn there. But we need to do a blend. And one of the original teachers of on the land activity is through the stories that were there before, the dialogue that's been honed for thousands of years. Human nature is very interesting without taking into consideration all the modern benefits that we have, is that it allows you to reconnect in a hard way. And those stories, the elders still hold. Our teachers closest to the land are the elders. We need to look at their stories and map out our travels so that we touch base on everything that means everything to us. And we have our traditional teachers, traditional counselors, and spiritual leaders that we need to rely on a little bit more. Because in the old way, they're naturally qualified to teach those things. And in modern context is really to find a way of moving through the architectural policies that exist to try to keep you away from the funds. We also need experts to deal with those kind of things. So in the end, it's how do we reconnect to on-the-land programming? Is that we're always the longer we're a step away from it, the more drawn in we are to the modern context. So to me, on-the-land programming is to put your feet back onto the original landscape through travel and get to hear the original stories of how people survived and the stories that come from it and the place names tell you stories along the way. So in the end, it's the land speaks for itself. And all we do is talk about our experiences. Our experiences is about coming to grips that we have the responsibility. We have the responsibility of ensuring that there is a continuation of the original story in a modern context. That story has to be told. And those stories can only happen by reconnecting to the traditional teachers, counselors, spiritual leaders, as a basis for how we can manage the modern context of making sure those things happen. And it means that we got to meet halfway somewhere. And I think a get-together like this is a beginning of those things. And these are just a sample of our own experiences, but we've been doing the Trails of Our Ancestors since 1995, because earlier I was saying we're traveling with Terry Simpson, and in the last year we were in a tent, we're sharing a tent, and he says, look, we've been doing it for 3 summers, and all this stuff is going to end up in a museum, and nobody's ever going to see the light of day. We need to, where's our people anyways? We need to get them back on the landscape. We should start something. So I always say that in the book, if you go to the first page, it's a picture of Harry as one of the founding members of Trails of Our Ancestors. And so the idea is that let's get youth back onto the landscape so that they get to experience what we need to tell them the stories. Because old people, they inherited all this knowledge, but they have nobody to pass it on to. And so they're full of it. And so sometimes when elders speak, they always say, well, I can't hang on to this stuff anymore because it hurts to keep it in. You got to let it out. So they'll let it out to anybody. Maybe it might not be reaching the right ears, but we need to create a forum for that. So we've been doing the trails of our ancestors on an annual basis since '95, and today it's 2017, so it's a little over 10 years. And the first group that we sent out was about 30. And so since then, it's been averaging, it can go up to 150 and somewhere between 30 and 150 on a yearly basis. So rough calculation, in over 20 years, I'll say a little over 1,000 of individuals that had the experience. And 20 years sounds like a long time, but it's a really short time if you shrink the time. And if you add all the times that we were there out on the landscape with as much youth as possible, that if we add up all the days, it adds up to less than a year. Okay? Because the challenge is that that same youth is going to spend at least 12 years in the north in education. And so the challenges are great, that we need to anchor them to the original strength, which is the landscape. So it's not easy today. It's hard, but if we have the same type of commitment that was there before, I'm sure we'll get there. So the idea is to put our feet back to where it was before. All these things that have happened in more modern times is something that has to be dealt with, but it shouldn't be what drives us. We need to put those things aside over time as individuals and as a collective to say that that's not what drives us today. We're going to get back on the original vehicle and ride that and strengthen ourselves in a modern context as to how these things flow to make those things work. Masicho.